Julian's reforms in Gaul, AD 359. These were the events of one and the same year in different parts of the world. The brothers Eusebius and Hypatius were now elevated to the consulship, and the situation in Gaul had improved. Julian, whose prestige was much enhanced by his career of unbroken successes, and who was now in winter quarters at Paris, laid aside for the time his military preoccupations, and devoted equal attention to a number of measures for the welfare of the provinces in his charge. He was particularly concerned to prevent the burden of taxation pressing too heavily, power being abused to acquire the property of others, men participating in public affairs who were enriching themselves by the general distress, and the departures from the rule of right by a judge going unpunished. This last abuse he was able to put right without difficulty by deciding in-person disputes which were important in themselves, or involved important persons, and by never allowing himself to be misled in distinguishing right from wrong. Many instances might be given of his admirable conduct in cases of this kind, but one will suffice to give a general indication of his way of acting and of speaking. Numerius, who had recently been the governor of Narbonese Gaul, was accused of embezzlement. His trial was thrown open to the public, and Julian showed unusual strictness in his examination. Numerius denied the charge, and his defence could not be shaken at any point. The lack of proof so infuriated Delphidius, who was attacking him violently in a fiery speech for the prosecution, that he exclaimed, "Will anyone ever be found guilty, your highness, if denial is enough to secure acquittal?" Julian on the spur of the moment countered him with this shrewd rejoinder, "Will anyone ever be acquitted if accusation is enough to secure conviction?" This is one instance among many of his humane behaviour. Campaign by Julian in Germany. Believing that some districts of Germany were hostile to him, and that their inhabitants would venture on outrages if they were not put down like the rest, Julian was about to embark on an urgent campaign, but was in a state of anxious indecision how to launch an offensive in sufficient force and with sufficient speed to anticipate rumours of his intention, and take them by surprise, as soon as a reasonable opportunity presented itself. After turning over many possibilities, he decided on a course whose efficacy was demonstrated by its results. Without anyone knowing, he sent an unattached tribune called Hierobordes, a man of tried loyalty and courage, on what appeared to be a mission to King Hortar, with whom our relations were already on a peaceful footing. His ulterior design was that Hierobordes, who had a thorough command of the native language, could then easily go on to the borders of those who were to be attacked and discover what they were about. Hierobordes set off boldly to carry out these orders, while Julian himself mobilized his troops when the campaigning season opened and took the field. He decided, however, that before engaging in hostilities, one thing above all imperatively demanded his attention. This was to enter and recover towns long since destroyed and abandoned, and repair their defences. Also to build granaries in place of those that had been burned, to store the corn regularly brought from Britain. In both these enterprises his speed exceeded all expectations. The granaries were quickly built and stored with ample supplies of food, and 7 towns were reoccupied. Fort Hercules, Quadriburgium, Trisonisma, Novicium, Bonn, Andronac, and Vingo, where by a stroke of good fortune the prefect Florentius suddenly made his appearance, bringing with him part of the army and enough provisions to last for a long time. After this, one vital task remained: the restoration of the walls of the reoccupied towns while it could be carried out without obstruction. This operation provided clear evidence that on this occasion the barbarians were ready to serve the interests of the empire from fear, and the Romans from love of their commander. The kings, in accordance with the agreement of the preceding year, sent a quantity of building material in their own carts, while the auxiliary troops, who always think such work beneath them, were so eager to respond to Julian's blandishments that they carried beams of 50 feet or more on their shoulders without complaint, and were of the greatest service in the building operations. While these works were rapidly going forward, Hyrobordes returned from his reconnaissance and reported what he had learned. On his arrival, the whole army made a forced march to Mainz. There, Florentius and Lupicinus, Servius's successor, obstinately insisted that they should build a bridge and cross the river. But the Caesar firmly rejected this proposal, arguing that they should not set foot on the territory of the tribes with whom they had made peace. Otherwise, if, as often happens, the troops in their brutal way destroyed whatever lay in their path, the treaties might come to an abrupt end. All the Germans, however, who were the object of our attack, tried, in view of the imminent danger in which they stood, to bully King Salmar, whom the previous treaty had made our friend, into preventing the Romans crossing, seeing that his territory adjoined the further bank of the Rhine. He declared that he could not resist single-handed, and the barbarians united in a single body and approached Mainz, determined to oppose a Roman crossing with all of their might, so the Caesar's policy was doubly justified. He had urged not only that they should not violate the territory of the tribes that had submitted, but also that they should not throw away lives by attempting to build a bridge in the face of fierce opposition. The right course was to march to a spot particularly suitable for the construction of a bridge. The enemy were clever enough to divine his purpose, and followed slowly along the opposite bank. When they saw our forces pitch their tents, they passed a sleepless night themselves, constantly on the alert to frustrate any attempt at a crossing. But when our troops reached the place we had in mind, they stopped to rest, protected by a rampart and ditch, and the Caesar, after consulting with Lupicinus, ordered reliable officers to equip 300 light-armed men with stakes, without, however, giving them any hint of what they were to do, or where they were to go. They were marshalled at dead of night and filled to capacity 40 patrol boats, all that were then available. Their orders were to float downstream in total silence with their oars out of the water, for fear that the splash might arouse the barbarians. So, while the enemy's attention was fixed on our campfires, these men, by their quickness and alertness, established a bridgehead on the opposite bank. During the execution of this coup, King Hortar, who was bound to us by treaty and had no thought of revolt, but was on friendly terms with his neighbours, had invited all the king's princes and chieftains to a feast, which he kept up after the custom of the country till long after midnight. As they were leaving, the guests accidentally fell in with our men, who attacked but could not kill or capture any of them. They got away in the darkness on horseback, wherever their blind career carried them. But their lackeys and slaves who were following on foot were killed, except for those who escaped detection in the gloom. When the news spread that a crossing had been forced by the Romans, who in this as in former campaigns, thought that the hardest part of their work was done once the enemy was located, the kings and their people, who had been desperately intent on preventing the building of a bridge, were terror-struck and scattered in disorderly flight. The violence of their rage abated, and they hastened to remove their families and possessions from harm's way. A bridge was at once built without any further difficulty, and sooner than their anxious foes expected, our troops appeared on barbarian soil and traversed the territory of King Hortar without inflicting any damage. But when they reached the lands of the kings who were still hostile, they burned and ravaged everything and ranged at will over the rebels' country, firing the frail homes in which they sheltered, putting a host of people to the sword, enjoying the spectacle of numbers falling and others begging for mercy. They came at last to a region called Palus, where boundary stones used to mark the frontier between the Romans and the Burgundians. There they encamped, so that Marcellinus and Hierobaudes might be received in a way which would not alarm them. These kings were brothers, who, seeing destruction at hand, had come in great agitation of mind to sue for peace. After them there arrived King Vadomar, whose dominion lay opposite August. He produced a letter from Constantius in which he was warmly spoken of, and was given the kind of reception proper for one who had been granted by the Augustus the status of a vassal of Rome. When Marcellinus and his brother found themselves among the eagles and standards, they were overwhelmed by the magnificent appearance of our armed forces, which they had never seen before, and begged mercy for their peoples. Vadomar, on the other hand, who lived near our frontier and was no stranger to us, admired our splendid field equipment, but remembered often seeing the like from his early youth. Finally, after long debate, it was unanimously decided that Marcellinus and Hierobaudes should be granted peace. Vadomar, however, who had come to ensure his own safety, but also as an intermediary to beg similar terms for King Urius, Ursicinus, and Vestralap, could not be given an immediate answer. In view of the fickle nature of the barbarians, there was a fear that those whom Vadomar represented might pluck up courage after the departure of our forces, and refuse to abide by terms obtained through the agency of another. But after the burning of their homes and harvests, and the death or capture of many of their people, these kings too sent envoys and begged as humbly for peace as if they had themselves been guilty of those offences against us. So they obtained peace on similar terms, one of which in particular they were required to fulfill at once, the surrender of all the prisoners they had taken in their frequent raids. Execution of Barbatio and his wife. While things were improving in Gaul under the providence of heaven, a new storm arose at the court of the Augustus, which began with a trifle and ended in grief and tears. The house of Barbatio, who then commanded the infantry, was visited by a remarkable swarm of bees, which caused him to consult in great anxiety experts in the interpretation of omens. They replied that the swarm foreshadowed a great danger, plainly basing their interpretation on the fact that these insects, once they have made their homes and gathered their store of honey, can only be driven away from their hives by smoke and the loud clash of cymbals. Barbatio's wife, whose name was Assyria, was an indiscreet and silly woman. After Barbatio had left for a campaign, seriously worried by the predictions which had been made to him, she succumbed to feminine folly and took into her confidence a maidservant, whom she had acquired from the estate of Silvanus, and who was an expert in cryptography. Through her she wrote an ill-judged letter to her husband, begging him almost with tears that when his hope of becoming emperor after the approaching death of Constantius was realized, he would not cast her off and enter into a marriage with Eusebia, who was then empress and a woman of unusual personal beauty. The letter was sent in the greatest possible secrecy, but when the army returned from the campaign, the maid took a copy of what she had written at her mistress's dictation, and carried the document in the early hours of the night to Arbitio, who received her eagerly. Arbitio, whose skill in framing a charge was unrivalled, relied on this evidence and reported it to the emperor. As usual, no time was lost in actively pursuing the affair. Arbitio confessed that he had received the letter. His wife was convicted on strong evidence of having written it, and both were beheaded. Their execution was followed by a wide-ranging inquisition in which many suffered, whether innocent or guilty. Among them was Valentinius, who had been promoted tribune from a position on the staff. He, with several others, was put to the torture more than once as an accessory to the crime, of which he was in fact totally ignorant. He survived, however, and as compensation for the injuries he had suffered, was advanced to the position of commander in Illyricum. This Arbitio was a man of rough manners and vaulting ambition, who had incurred general hatred by his treacherous betrayal of the Caesar Gallus when he was in command of his guard, and because after the latter's death, elated by promotion to a higher rank, he formed similar plots against the Caesar Julian, and poured much malice into the receptive ears of the Augustus, to the great indignation of honourable men. He cannot have known the wise saying of old Aristotle, who, when he sent his pupil and kinsman Callisthenes on a mission to King Alexander, repeatedly enjoined him to speak as little as possible in the presence of a man in whose tongue lay the power of life and death, and then only in pleasant terms. It need cause no surprise that men whose minds we believe to be akin to the divine can sometimes distinguish between what is likely to benefit them and the reverse, since even irrational animals protect themselves at times by observing dead silence. The following is well known as an example of this. When wild geese, in their migration from east to west to escape the heat, approached the Taurus mountains, where eagles are common, their fear of these formidable birds leads them to stop up their beaks with small stones, to prevent a cry escaping them, however hard pressed. But when they have passed over these hills in rapid flight, they let the stones fall, and so pursue their way free from fear. Sapor prepares for war. While great pains were being devoted to this inquiry at Sirmium, the dread trumpets of approaching danger were being sounded in the east. The king of Persia, reinforced by the wild peoples on whom he had imposed peace, and burning with superhuman eagerness to extend his realm, was preparing his armed forces and their commissariat. Necromancy was invoked to assist his plans, and no method of divining the future left untried. He intended, with all his preparations, to launch a full-scale invasion at the beginning of spring. When the first rumours of this were confirmed by reliable reports, overwhelming fear of imminent danger kept everyone in suspense. The gang of courtiers, hammering day and night at the instigation of the eunuchs on the same anvil, to use the proverbial phrase, kept the image of Ursicinus before the mind of the timid and suspicious emperor, like a kind of Gorgon's head, constantly repeating that, since for lack of better men, he had been sent again to defend the East after the death of Silvanus, he was planning for a higher position. Several, moreover, attempted by persistent, sickening flattery of this kind to purchase the favour of Eusebius, the Grand Chamberlain, with whom, if the truth be told, Constantius had great influence, and who had a double reason for launching a bitter attack upon the master of cavalry. Ursicinus stood out above the rest as the only man who did without Eusebius' help, and he would not give up to Eusebius his house at Antioch, which the later most importunately demanded from him. Like a snake bursting with venom, which sends out a swarm of its little ones to do mischief when they can scarcely crawl, Eusebius dispatched his subordinates the moment they reached maturity to assail the reputation of the hero with malicious suggestions, which their attendance in private gave them the chance of insinuating into the ears of the credulous emperor, in the childish and reedy voice of their kind. They promptly carried out their instructions. It is discussed with these creatures and their like that leads me to praise the early Emperor Domitian, who, though he was unlike his father and brother and disgraced his memory by acts which merit undying detestation, nevertheless, he distinguished himself by one most welcome measure. He forbade under threat of severe penalties the castration of any boy within the bounds of the Roman jurisdiction. If he had not done so, who could have endured the resulting swarms of eunuchs, since we can barely tolerate them in small numbers? Still Eusebius proceeded with caution, pretending that if Ursicinus were recalled, he might start a revolution. His real motive, however, was to bring him to the block as soon as a favourable chance presented itself. While Ursicinus' enemies, prey to anxiety, were playing a waiting game, we were making a short stay at Samosata, the famous capital of the former kingdom of Comagni. There we suddenly received repeated and consistent reports of a new commotion, which will be unfolded in succeeding pages. Defection of Antoninus to Persia. There was a man called Antoninus who, after making a fortune in trade, had become a financial official in the service of the commander of Mesopotamia, and finally a staff officer. He was a man of experience and intelligence and was very well known in that part of the world. He found himself involved in great losses through the greed of certain persons, and realizing that he was being more and more unfairly treated in his struggle against powerful interests, because those who were examining his case were inclined to show favour to the stronger side, he decided not to kick against the pricks, but to adopt a more yielding and obsequious attitude. He acknowledged his debts, which had been collusively transferred to the imperial treasury, and then, with a monstrous project in mind, devoted himself to prying secretly into all the departments of state. He had a command of both languages, which enabled him to examine the records and to note what forces were serving where and in what strength, and what would be their objective when they took the field, and he was indefatigable in his inquiries into the stocks of arms and provisions and other military supplies. When he had learnt the secrets of the whole East, while the greater part of the army and the money to pay it was distributed over Illyricum, where the emperor was detained by serious business, the appointed day drew near when he must pay the sum for which fear of violence had compelled him to give his bond. Seeing that danger threatened to crush him on all sides, and that the treasury was putting such cruel pressure on him to pay in order to gratify another party, he took the prodigious step of attempting to desert to the Persians with his wife and children and all he held dear. To evade the frontier guards, he bought cheap a property in Hyaspis, a district immediately bordering the Tigris. This device made him a landowner with a large staff, and no one dared to inquire why he visited the extreme limits of the Roman world. Through faithful friends who could swim, he conducted a secret correspondence with Tamsapor, who was in charge of the defence of the whole region on the opposite bank, and who was already known to him. Finally, assisted by a body of active men from the Persian camp, he embarked in boats at dead of night, and was ferried across with all his loved ones, like Zopyrus, who made himself famous by betraying Babylon, though with the opposite intention. When things had come to this pass in Mesopotamia, the palace clique, with an eye to our destruction, kept up their old refrain, and at last found a handle for injuring our heroic general. The plan was contrived and pushed on by the gang of eunuchs, who are always savage and bitter, and who, because they lack family ties, lavish on wealth alone the affection due to a beloved child. It was decided that Sabinian, an elderly man of culture and wealth but no soldier, whose obscurity had hitherto kept him far from a senior appointment, should be sent to govern the East, while Marcellinus returned to the court to take over command of the infantry in succession to Barbetio. It was thought that the presence at home of a man whom they loudly averred was set on revolution would lay him open to formidable attack by his deadly enemies. While the court of Constantius was the scene of doings fit for the brothel or the stage, and the distributors of bribes were sharing out among the houses of the influential the price of the office suddenly put on sale, Antoninus was conducted to the king's winter quarters, and received with open arms. The honour of the tiara was conferred upon him. This entitles the wearer to be placed at the royal table, and to offer advice and bring forward his views in discussions of affairs of state. Henceforward Antoninus embarked upon his attacks on Rome, not by dark and winding channels, which need a pole or a tow rope, so to speak, but under full sail. He worked upon the king, like Maharabal reproaching Hannibal for his slowness, by constantly asserting that, though he could win victories, he did not know how to use them. His training and wide experience in public life gained him an attentive hearing from a lively audience anxious to have its ears charmed. They listened to him like the Phaeacians in Homer, not with applause but with silent wonder, while he, going back 40 years, reminded them that in spite of constant successes, especially at Hylia and Singara, where after a bitter battle by night in which our troops were cut to pieces with enormous losses, hostilities were broken off as if a herald had interposed his sacred person. The Persians had not yet reached Edessa, or the bridges over the Euphrates, whereas their military might and splendid successes ought to have given them the confidence to enlarge their realm over the whole of Asia, especially at a time when the best blood of Rome was being spilled on both sides in a prolonged civil war. These and such are the arguments which the deserter who kept sober himself employed from time to time at the banquets at which, like the ancient Greeks, the Persians are in the habit of discussing military and other matters of serious nature. He fired the eager king to take the field as soon as the winter was over, confident of success, and boldly promised for his own part to help in any way that was needed. Marcellinus is recalled from the east and then sent back. Almost at the same moment, Sabinian, bursting with pride at his unexpected appointment, arrived in Cilicia and delivered to his predecessor the emperor's letter. This invited Marcellinus to make all haste to the court to be invested with a higher honour, and this at a crisis which on any rational calculation would have demanded his presence in the east, had he been in the furthest north. in view of his long experience in the service and his intimate knowledge of the Persian way of fighting. The people of the provinces were cut to the heart by this news. In the towns the magistrates and populace passed resolution after resolution with loud acclaim, and almost laid hands on him in their effort to detain the man whom they looked on as the protector of them all. They remembered that when he was left to defend them with an inactive and apathetic force, he had suffered no loss for 10 years, and they feared for their safety when they discovered that he was to be removed at this critical moment, and replaced by a man who was totally incompetent. Rumour, we believe beyond a shadow of a doubt, flies through the air on the wings of the wind. The news of our situation, which it carried, brought the deliberations of the Persians to a head, and after much discussion it was decided on the proposition of Antoninus that since Marcellinus had been removed, and the new man was beneath contempt, they should not involve themselves in the dangers of siege operations, but burst straight over the Euphrates and take by surprise the provinces which in all previous wars, except in the time of Gallienus, had been left untouched, and which had grown rich in the course of a long peace. In this enterprise Antoninus promised, God willing, to be a most useful guide. This proposal met with unanimous approval. Everyone busied himself in the rapid collection of what was needed, and the preparation of provisions, troops, weapons, and other military stores for the approaching campaign went on during the whole winter. We, meanwhile, after a short stop on the nearer side of the Taurus, were hurrying towards Italy in obedience with our orders, and had nearly reached the river Maritza, which rises in the mountains of the Odrace, when we received a letter from the emperor bidding us to lose no time in returning to Mesopotamia, where we should have to undertake a dangerous enterprise without any staff, since the entire command had been transferred to another. This was designed by those who moulded the policy of the government for their mischievous ends, to ensure that if the Persians returned unsuccessfully to their own territory, the glory of the achievement should fall to the new commander, while if disaster ensued, Marcellinus could be indicted for betraying his country. After much debate, and with much hesitation, we returned to find Sabinian full of self-importance. He was a man of middle height, with a mean and narrow mind, so shamefully nervous that he could hardly bear the slight disturbance of a noisy party, still less the din of battle. Since, however, our scouts reported that the enemy was in a fever of preparation, and this was persistently confirmed by deserters, we left the little man yawning, and marched in haste to make ready for the defence of Nisibis, fearing that the Persians might disguise their intention to besiege it and then fall upon it unaware. While the necessary measures were being pushed on inside the walls, smoky fires were seen flickering from the direction of the Tigris, past the Moors' fort, and Caesarea, and the rest of the frontier country in an unbroken chain right up to the city, in such unusual numbers that it was clear that the enemy's raiding parties had broken through and crossed the river. We hurried on at full speed in case the roads should be blocked, but when we were 2 miles from the city we came upon a child crying in the middle of the road. He was a fine boy, apparently 8 years old, and was wearing a neck ornament. He told us that he was the son of a man of good family, and that his mother, panic-stricken at the approach of the enemy, had abandoned him because he was a clog on her flight. Our general pitied him, and on his orders I set the boy before me on my horse and took him back into the city. But I found the walls already invested and the enemy parties scouring the neighbourhood. Dreading to find myself involved in the miseries of a siege, I put the boy down in the shelter of a postern gate that was not entirely shut, and galloped back half dead with fear to rejoin our column, but I only just avoided capture. A troop of the enemy's horse was pursuing a tribune called Abdergild and his servant. The master got away, but the servant was caught. At the moment when I darted by, they were asking him who was the official who had left the city, and when they heard that it was Marcellinus, who had visited the city shortly before and was now making for Mount Isala, they killed their informant, got together more of their number in a single body, and pursued me unflaggingly. Thanks to the speed of my mount, I kept in front of them and found our men, who had turned their horses out to graze, taking their ease by the ramshackle fort of Ammianus. I stretched out my arm, gathered up the edges of my cloak, and waved it in the air, to give the usual signal that the enemy was upon them. In their company I was carried along at their pace, although my horse was now almost drooping. Our alarm was increased by the full moon and the flatness of the country around, which was devoid of trees and bushes and covered only by short grass, so that if we were hard pressed we should have nowhere to hide. So we adopted the device of tying a lighted lantern securely on the back of a pack animal and turning it loose by itself without a driver towards the left, while we pursued our way towards the hills on the right. The idea was that the Persians would believe that this torch of tallow was lighting the slow progress of our general, and would take that road rather than any other. But for this trick, we should have been surrounded and taken, and have fallen into the hands of the enemy. Having escaped this danger, we came to a wooded area called Maya, which is planted with vines and fruit trees, and takes its name from its cold springs. All the inhabitants had disappeared, but lurking in a remote corner, we found a single soldier, who was brought before our general. Suspicion was aroused by the inconsistent answers he gave in his fright, and finally threats extracted from him the whole truth. He was a native of Gaul, born in Paris, and had served in a cavalry regiment, but to escape punishment for some offence, had deserted to Persia. There he married and raised a family, and was so well thought of that he was employed as a spy and often brought back reliable information from behind our lines. On the present occasion he had been sent by Tamaspor and Nohodares, the grandees in command of the raiding parties, and was on his way back to report to them. When he had told us all what he knew of the operations of the other side, he was put to death. This incident heightened our anxiety, and we hurried on as fast as we could to Amida, a town which later calamities made famous. There our scouts rejoined us and brought a sheet of parchment written in code and hidden in a scabbard. It came from Procopius, who had been sent with Count Lucilian on a mission to the Persians, as I have already said. The purport of the message, which was deliberately wrapped in obscure terms to prevent the dreadful consequences that would follow if its bearers were seized and its contents understood, was as follows: The envoys of the Greeks have been removed to a distance and may be put to death. The aged king, not content with Hellespont, will throw bridges across the Granicus and the Rhindacus and invade Asia with a vast host. He is easily roused to passion and very cruel, and his natural temper is being worked upon and inflamed by a man who is the successor of the former Roman Emperor Hadrian. If Greece does not take steps in time, all will be utterly lost. The inner meaning of this was that the Persian king, under the influence of Antoninus, had crossed the Anzarba and the Tigris, and was aiming at domination over the whole East. When the message had been deciphered, a matter of great difficulty because of its extreme obscurity, a clever plan was formed. Corduene, which was subject to Persia, was ruled at that time by a satrap who was known on Roman soil as Jovian. He was a young man whose secret sympathies lay with us, because as a hostage in Syria he had succumbed to the charm of liberal studies, and ardently desired to return to our land. I was sent to him, together with a loyal centurion, to discover more accurately what was happening. Our way led through pathless mountains and steep gorges. On my arrival he recognized me and received me warmly, and I communicated to him in confidence why I was there. He sent me with a silent guide who knew the country to a high and rocky place a long way off, from which, if one's eyesight were good enough, the smallest object would be visible 50 miles away. We waited there 2 whole days, and at dawn on the 3rd day, we saw the whole expanse of country below us, stretching to what we Greeks call the horizon, covered with columns of troops, headed by the king in gleaming robes. On his left was Grumbates, king of the Cheonite, a man in middle life and of withered frame, but renowned for his great spirit and many glorious victories. On the king's right was the king of the Albani, Grumbates' equal in rank and honour. Behind them came various highly placed generals, followed by a host of all ranks drawn from the flower of the neighbouring peoples, and endured to hardship by long experience. How far can the Greeks' love of the fabulous go? They are always talking of the town of Doriscus in Thrace, and of the armies which were counted there by being enclosed regiment by regiment in a pen, whereas I, a cautious or, to tell the truth, a timid historian, refrain from exaggerating what has been placed beyond doubt by reliable evidence. Sapor invades Mesopotamia. Passing by Nineveh, the great city of Adiabene, the kings offered sacrifice in the middle of the bridge over the Anzaba, and finding the omens favourable, crossed with great confidence. Judging that the rest of the host would take at least 3 days to penetrate our territory, we returned in haste to rest and recruit our strength with the hospitable satrap. Then, faster than might have been expected, we retraced our steps over the lonely wilderness, taking comfort from the thought that necessity left us no choice, and brought to our perplexed comrades the sure news that the kings, without making any detour, had crossed the river on a single bridge of boats. Dispatch riders were sent at once to Cassian, the general in Mesopotamia, and Euphronius, then governor of the province, with orders to compel the country folk to move with their families and all their livestock to places of safety. Carrhae was to be evacuated immediately because of the weakness of its fortifications, and the whole country set on fire to deprive the enemy of a source of fodder. No time was lost in carrying out these instructions, and once fire was applied, the fury of the raging element so completely burned up the young vegetation and the grain, which was already swelling on its yellow stalks, that from the banks of the Tigris to the Euphrates not a green thing was to be seen. At the same time, many wild animals were burnt to death, especially lions, which infest that region to a fearful extent, and often meet their end or lose their sight in the following way. The reed beds and thickets which fringe the rivers of Mesopotamia are the haunt of countless lions, which are always harmless during the mild winters that prevail there. But when the burning sun brings the torrid season, and the country is scorched by the heat, they are plagued by the sultry weather, and by the hosts of midges which swarm all over that part of the world. These insects are attracted by the moistness and brightness of the lion's eyes, and settle on the surface of their eyelids. Then the lions, driven mad by the irritation, either plunge into the river to escape the tortures and are drowned, or else lose their sight, by constantly scratching their eyes with their claws and are driven to a frenzy of rage. But for this the whole of the East would be overrun by these creatures. While the country was being burned, as I have told, tribunes were sent with members of the staff to reinforce our bank of the Euphrates with strong points and sharp stakes and every kind of defensive device. At potential crossings, where the stream was free from eddies, they planted engines which hurl missiles. While these hasty measures were being taken, Sabinian, the general so appropriately chosen to conduct a deadly war, at a time when the common danger required that not a moment should be lost, was leading a life of dissolute luxury among the cemeteries of Edessa. Secure, I suppose, in the belief that the dead were in no position to disturb the peace. He was being entertained in an atmosphere of profound calm by a Pyrrhic war dance, in which the gestures of the participants were accompanied by music. This was a performance which augured ill in itself, and particularly in such a place, since the course of events teaches us that all good men should avoid words and acts of this kind, which are a sad presage of troubles to come. Meanwhile the kings passed by Nisibis without thinking it worthwhile to halt. The fires were spreading through the varieties of dry material which they found to feed on, and to avoid a shortage of fodder the Persians took their way through the grassy valleys at the foot of the mountains. When they came to the domain of Babasi, between which and the town of Constantina, 100 miles away, the country is parched by perpetual drought, except for a trickle of water in the wells. They hesitated for some time about their best course. Finally, they decided to trust in the endurance of their men and brave the desert, only to learn that the Euphrates, swollen with melted snow, had burst its banks over a wide area, and could not be forded anywhere. Finding themselves unexpectedly frustrated, they decided to embrace whatever opportunity chance threw in their way. In view of the danger of their position, they held an emergency meeting and told Antoninus to give his opinion. He at once advised them to turn to the right and make a considerable detour through an area which could supply all their needs, and which the Romans had left untouched, in the belief that the enemy would take the direct route. He would show the way to the two fortified camps of Barzalo and Claudius, where the river, being still near its source and not yet augmented by tributaries, was swollen and narrow and easily fordable. This advice was adopted. Antoninus was told to guide them by the way he knew, and the whole army abandoned its projected route and followed his lead. Ammianus reaches Amida. Hearing reports of these movements from reliable scouts, we decided to hurry to Samosata, cross the river at that point, and break down the bridges at Zeugma and Capasana, trusting that fortune would enable us to repel the enemy's attack. But a dreadful disgrace befell us, which would be better buried in complete oblivion. Some 700 horse in 2 squadrons had lately been sent from Illyricum to reinforce Mesopotamia. They were a feeble and cowardly lot, and were given the duty of keeping watch over the enemy's route. They were so afraid of being surprised at night that in the evening, when it was particularly necessary that every path should be guarded, they used to withdraw to a distance from the main roads. Tamsapor and Nohodar became aware of this, and took advantage of their drunken sleep to slip by unseen, with a force of some 20,000 Persians, who were hidden with their weapons behind some high ground in the neighbourhood of Amida. We, as I said, were about to set off for Samosata, and were on the march before it was fully light, when we reached a point of vantage. The gleam of shining arms struck our eyes. An excited shout proclaimed that the enemy was upon us, so in obedience to the usual signal we halted in close order. Prudence suggested that we should neither take flight since our pursuers were in view, nor yet meet certain death by giving battle to an enemy who were our superior in numbers and cavalry. At last, when a clash became absolutely inevitable, but while we were still in doubt about our tactics, some of our men were rash enough to run out in front of our line and were killed. Both sides pressed forward, and Antoninus, leading a troop spoiling for the fight, was recognised by Marcellinus, who denounced him in violent terms as a traitor and a criminal. Thereupon Antoninus took from his head the tiara which he wore as a badge of honour, sprang from his horse, and, bowing so low that his face almost touched the ground, addressed Marcellinus as his patron and master, at the same time clasping his hands behind his back, a gesture of supplication among the Assyrians. "Forgive me," he said, "most noble Count, for conduct which I know is criminal, but which springs from necessity, not from choice. It is the exactions of wicked men, as you know, which have ruined me. Against their avarice, even so great a man as you has been unable to defend my wretched self." With these words he withdrew, not turning away, but walking backwards respectfully till he was out of sight. Some half an hour had passed thus, when our rearguard, who occupied higher ground, shouted that they had seen another body of heavy cavalry behind us, and that it was fast approaching. As often happens in such desperate circumstances, we were in doubt which way we should or could face, and under the pressure of the vast throng we all scattered and took each the nearest way out. But in the course of this sauve-qui-pet, our broken troops became involved with the enemy skirmishers, so we gave ourselves up for lost and made a brave fight of it as we were driven to the banks of the Tigris, which at that point are deeply undercut. Some were driven headlong over the edge and stuck in the shallows, hampered by their armour. Others were sucked down by eddies. A number kept up the fight against the enemy with varying success, while a few, terrified by the massed formations, made for the nearest spurs of the Taurus mountains. Among these was our general himself. He was recognised and surrounded by a crowd of assailants, but the speed of his horse enabled him to get away with the tribune Idelthes and a single groom. I, meanwhile, had been separated from my comrades and was considering my best course, when I fell in with Verinian, a staff officer whose thigh had been pierced by an arrow. While I was trying to pull it out at his earnest entreaty, I was surrounded by the foremost Persians and made for the town, crawling along out of breath. On the side on which we were attacked, the approach to the town lay up a steep hill. This could be scaled only by a single narrow passage, which was further constricted by large blocks quarried from the hills and set in close order to reduce the width of the path. Here we remained motionless until the following morning, mixed with the Persians who were making the same strenuous effort to reach the higher ground. We were so tightly packed that the bodies of the dead remained upright in the press because there was no room for them to fall, and a soldier in front of me, whose head had been split into two equal halves by a powerful sword strike, was so hemmed in on all sides that his corpse stood there like a stump. Showers of missiles from every kind of engine flew from the battlements, but we were saved from these by being so near to the walls. At last I made my way in through a postern gate and found the town crammed with people of both sexes who had flocked in from the neighbourhood. It so happened that this was the very time at which an annual fair was held in the suburbs, so that the normal population was swollen by crowds of country folk. There was a confused babble of cries. Some were lamenting their lost friends, and others were mortally wounded. Many were calling out the names of their nearest and dearest, whom they could not see by reason of the throng. Description of Amida. The town was once very small, but Constantius, while he was still Caesar, and at the same time as he built another town called Antoninopolis, enclosed it with strong towers and walls to provide a safe place of refuge for the neighbourhood, and established it as an arsenal of engines to repel an assault. This made it a formidable stronghold, which he desired to have called after his own name. On its southern side it is washed by a bend of the Tigris, which rises nearby. Where it faces the east, it looks down on the plains of Mesopotamia. On the north, it is close to the river Nymphaeus and overshadowed by the peaks of Taurus, which divide the peoples beyond the Tigris from Armenia. And on the west, it borders Galmathina, a rich and well-cultivated region in which there is a village called Abani, celebrated for its medicinal hot springs. In the heart of Amida itself there gushes out beneath the citadel an abundant spring, which is drinkable and sometimes stinks in hot and humid weather. The permanent garrison of the town consisted of the Legion 5 Parthica, together with a respectable detachment of native horse, but at this time its strong defences were also manned by 6 further legions, which had forestalled the approach of the Persian army by forced marches. There were troops of Magnentius and Decentius, who at the conclusion of the civil war had been posted by the emperor on account of their disloyalty and bad discipline to the east, where there was no fear of any but a foreign enemy. There were also the men of Legion 30 and 10, Frontenses, together with the skirmishers and scouts under the command of Aelian, who was now a count. These last, while they were still raw recruits, had made a sally from Singara under the same officer, then only a staff officer, and had slaughtered a great number of Persians in their sleep, as I have related earlier. Finally, there were the greater part of the household archers, the name given to detachments of horse in which serve all the barbarians of free birth, who are preeminent for skill in arms and physical strength. Surrender of 2 Roman forts. While the storm of the Persians' first offensive was causing this unexpected disturbance, the king with his own people, and the others under his command, turned to the right at Bebasai, in accordance with Antoninus' advice, and took the road by Horon and Myakariae and Karaka, as if he meant to leave Amida on one side. As he approached 2 Roman forts called Reman and Busan, he was informed by some deserters that many people had removed their treasures to these places, believing that it would be safe within their high walls. He was told, too, that he would find there with valuable chattels a woman of great beauty with her little daughter. She was the wife of one Cragasius of Nisibis, whose birth, reputation, and influence had won him great respect among the worthies of the town. So Sapor, spurred on by greed to possess himself of others' property, felt no qualms about launching an assault, and the inhabitants, panic-stricken at the sight of his multifarious array, surrendered themselves and all those who had taken refuge with them. On the order to evacuate the place, they at once gave up the keys, and once the gates were open, all the treasure stored within was ransacked, Women were dragged out stupefied with fear and with their children clinging to them. Even at their tender age, they were fated to experience the bitterest of grief. The king, finding by inquiry which was the wife of Crogasius, ordered that she should be allowed to approach him without fear, though she expected that she would be offered violence. Her face was covered with a black veil that left only her lips exposed, and when the king saw her, he gave her a courteous assurance that she might hope to be reunited with her husband, and that her honour should remain unspoiled. Hearing that her husband loved her passionately, he thought that he could use her to purchase the betrayal of Nisibis. Finding that there were also other women who had been consecrated to a life of virginity according to the rites of the Christians, the king ordered that they too should be kept inviolate and allowed to practice their accustomed worship without hindrance. This pretence of mildness was assumed for the occasion in the hope that all who he had previously terrified by his dread cruelty would lay aside their fear and come over to him of their own accord, once they realized from these latest instances that he now intended to employ his great success with humanity and gentleness